When Richard Montgomery, a billionaire real estate mogul from Chicago, decides to personally oversee the eviction of a family of squatters from one of his properties, he never imagines he's about to face the greatest shock of his life. For 9 years, he has built an empire of concrete and steel, amassing millions through ruthless deals and a calculated coldness that leaves no room for feelings. But when a desperate woman and her 9-year-old son are forced to leave the only shelter they've ever known, something unexpected happens. The child, with a courage beyond his years, approaches the powerful man holding a yellow document that could change everything. A birth certificate bearing a familiar name, a truth buried nearly a decade ago, and a secret that will turn a stone-cold heart into something human. When Tommy shouts the fateful words, and Richard reads what's written on the paper, the billionaire will learn that some prices are too high to pay, and that the most valuable wealth he's lost can't be measured in dollars.
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story. The afternoon sun in Chicago filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 52nd floor, bathing Richard Montgomery's office in golden hues that contrasted sharply with the coldness of the space. The silence was broken only by the almost imperceptible whisper of the air conditioner and the rustling of papers being turned with mechanical precision. Richard, at 52 years old, exuded power even when seated. His salt and pepper hair, perfectly styled, framed a face that looked carved from marble-sharp lines, a firm jaw, steel blue eyes that rarely revealed any emotion. His long, manicured fingers moved over the reports spread out on the mahogany desk, each movement calculated, each analysis as cold as the numbers dancing before his eyes. Property on North Ashland Avenue. 17% annual return, he murmured to himself, his deep voice echoing across the spacious office, decorated with modern art and a panoramic view of the Loop. South Side. Potential for commercial development. The reports came one after another like moves in a giant chess game. Each property a strategic play in the empire he had built brick by brick, contract by contract. Richard had long learned that feelings were a luxury businessmen couldn't afford. Chicago was in his veins, but not as a beloved city as conquered territory. The heavy oak door opened with a soft click, and James Patterson, his executive assistant for 8 years, entered with measured steps. The man in his early 30s carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression Richard knew well, the neutral face of someone about to report something that required immediate decisions. "Mr. Montgomery," James said, standing respectfully before the desk, "we have a situation at the building on West Roosevelt Road that needs your attention." Richard didn't look up from the papers immediately. His fingers continued to drum silently over the report. He was analyzing a property in Lincoln Park, promising a 25% increase in value over the next 2 years. "Roosevelt Road," he repeated, voice heavy with controlled patience. "The building we acquired through foreclosure last month?" "Exactly, sir. Our property inspector found there are illegal occupants there. A family, apparently. They're using the second floor as their residence." Finally, Richard raised his gaze. His blue eyes fixed on James with laser-like intensity, processing the information with the same coldness he used to analyze financial spreadsheets. The building was worth around $200,000, not much in the context of his $300 million portfolio, but principles were principles. "A family," he repeated slowly, as if savoring each syllable. "And how long do you think they've been there?" "At least a few weeks, sir, maybe a month. There's evidence they improvised basic utilities, electricity irregularly reconnected, water too." Richard leaned back in his Italian leather executive chair, fingers steepled over his chest. Through the window, he could see the hectic movement of LaSalle Street far below. Tiny people chasing their own dreams and ambitions. He himself had started like that decades ago, when Chicago was just a city of opportunity, not a personal empire. "James," he said at last, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had made countless similar decisions, "you know my position on property invasions." "Yes, sir. Zero tolerance." "Exactly." Richard opened the right drawer of his desk and pulled out a Mont Blanc pen that had cost more than many families earned in a month. "Business is business. I can't let this set a precedent. If one property of mine can be invaded without consequences, they all can." James nodded, already anticipating the instructions. He had witnessed this scene dozens of times, Richard turning complex human situations into simple math equations. Problem identified, solution applied, result delivered. I want you to contact Brennan and Associates immediately, Richard continued, his voice gaining the efficient rhythm of an experienced executive. Request an emergency eviction order. 48 hours maximum. Richard's fingers danced over his computer keyboard, pulling up the property management system that tracked every square foot of his empire. The Roosevelt Road property appeared on screen, exterior photos, floor plans, transaction history. To him, it was just digital data organized into virtual folders. And the family, sir? James asked, maintaining a professional tone, though something in his eyes suggested a humanity Richard had long learned to ignore. Richard paused for a fraction of a second, pen hovering over the documents. For a fleeting moment, something passed through his eyes, perhaps a memory of distant times when he himself had known financial uncertainty. But the moment passed like a cloud before the sun, and the professional mask snapped back into place. The family is not my responsibility, he replied, signing the documents with firm, deliberate movements. There are shelters, government programs, charities. My responsibility is to protect my assets and uphold the integrity of my business. The sound of the pen on paper echoed through the silent office like a hammer driving a nail into the coffin of an irreversible decision. Richard signed his name with the same precision he executed every transaction, each letter a declaration of power, each stroke an assertion that in his world, market law outweighed any sentimental consideration. Also, he added, handing the signed papers to James, make sure our security team conducts regular patrols at the property after the eviction. I don't want this problem to happen again. James took the papers, feeling the weight of the decision in his hands. It will be done, Mr. Montgomery. Any other instructions? Richard had already turned his attention back to the reports on his desk, as if the conversation about the displaced family was just another item crossed off his to-do list. Just make sure everything is done legally, he muttered without looking up. I want full documentation of every step in the process. As James headed for the door, Richard stayed there, surrounded by the symbols of his success-framed diplomas from Northwestern University. Photos of him shaking hands with politicians and other moguls, real estate industry trophies decorating the shelves. Every object told the story of a man who had conquered Chicago not with dreams, but with relentless determination and an almost unlimited ability to separate business from emotion. The sun continued its journey across the sky, and shadows in the office began to lengthen. Richard Montgomery, emperor of a kingdom of concrete and steel, remained at work, while somewhere on the city's outskirts, a family unknowingly prepared to discover that in Richard's world, there was no place for trespassers, even if they were just desperate people seeking a roof over their heads. The icy Chicago wind whistled through the cracks of the broken windows, carrying with it the sharp scent of the city and the promise of another tough night. On the second floor of the abandoned building on West Roosevelt Road, Maria Santos carefully wrapped a faded blanket around her thin shoulders, her trembling fingers fighting against the cold that seemed to have settled permanently in her bones. At 35, Maria bore the marks of battles no woman should have to face alone. Her brown hair, once shiny and well cared for, now fell in dull strands over her shoulders, held back by a worn-out hair tie. But her dark eyes still held a flicker of determination, the kind of strength only a desperate mother can keep alive. "Mom, is the food ready yet?" asked Tommy, his voice echoing in the empty space they had made their home over the past 6 months. Tommy Santos, just 9 years old, had a maturity no child should have. His large, expressive eyes showed sharp intelligence, but also constant worry, as if he carried on his small shoulders some of the heavy weight his mother faced every day. His jeans showed invisible patches Maria sewed by candlelight, and his navy blue sweatshirt, though clean, was clearly too big for his thin frame. "Almost sweetheart," Maria replied, carefully stirring the contents of the aluminum can they used as a pot. The makeshift stove sat on a small camping burner they had found at a thrift store for $5, an investment that meant giving up 2 meals that week. The smell of beans with bits of cheap sausage filled the room, mixing with the damp and dusty odor that clung to every corner of the building. Maria had learned to turn almost nothing into what looked like a real lunch, a skill she never imagined she'd have to develop. As she waited for the food to heat, her eyes scanned the space they called home. The wooden floor was covered with cardboard and old blankets they had gathered from donations and trash bins. On the wall, Tommy had drawn with colored chalk he found on the street a bright yellow sun, a house with a smoking chimney, 2 stick figures holding hands. "Me and Mom in our real home," he had said when he finished the drawing. "Tommy, come eat," Maria called, serving the beans in 2 cracked plastic plates. The boy approached quietly. He had learned to move without making noise, a precaution that had become instinct in their new reality. They sat on the floor, side by side, sharing their meager meal. Tommy ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. Maria watched him while pretending to eat in truth. She always left most of her portion for him, saying she wasn't very hungry. "Mom," Tommy said suddenly, "do you remember when we lived in our old house?" The question hit Maria like a punch to the stomach. Her eyes blinked shut involuntarily, and for a moment, she was transported back in time. Those were different times. Maria Santos, then 26, walked confidently down the halls of Morrison and Associates, a financial consulting firm in downtown Chicago. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she carried a folder of important documents. Her navy blue suit was impeccable, her hair pulled into an elegant bun, and she radiated the confidence of a young woman building a solid career. "Maria, I need those reports by 5 o'clock, Mr. Morrison said, rushing past her in the hallway. "And don't forget to reschedule my meeting with the Japanese investors." "Of course, Mr. Morrison. It's all taken care of," she replied, smiling with the satisfaction of someone who knew she was indispensable. Back then, she earned $42,000 a year, not a fortune, but enough to rent a 1-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park, buy decent clothes, and even save a little money for the future. She had plans. Maybe go back to school at night to finish her business degree. Maybe ask for a promotion the following year. Then she found out she was pregnant. The memory turned bitter in Maria's mind. She opened her eyes to find Tommy looking at her with concern. "I remember, honey," she said softly, stroking the boy's hair. "I remember you playing in your little room with those toy cars you loved so much." The pregnancy had been a surprise. Tommy's father, a man she thought she loved, but who disappeared as soon as he learned the news, left her completely alone to face the consequences. Maria tried to hide the pregnancy as long as she could, fearing exactly what ended up happening. "Maria, I need to talk to you," Mr. Morrison said that dreadful September morning. "Someone told me you're in a delicate situation." She felt her blood run cold. "Sir, I can explain. You know, Maria, you're a good employee, but our firm has an image to maintain. Our clients expect total professionalism, and frankly, a single secretary who's pregnant doesn't exactly send the message we want to convey." His words echoed in her mind like gunshots. "Are you firing me? I'm giving you the opportunity to resign gracefully. 2 months' salary as severance. It's more than many companies would offer." Tommy was finishing his portion when he asked, "Mom, do you think we'll get our new house soon?" Maria swallowed the lump in her throat. Since losing her job, her life had been a slippery downhill. Without steady income, she couldn't pay rent. The severance lasted only 2 months. Then came temporary jobs, minimum wage shifts at diners, sleepless nights trying to make numbers add up that never did. Losing the apartment was inevitable. First, they stayed with a distant cousin in Pilsen. But things became unbearable when Tommy started asking why they slept on the living room couch. Then, a few months in a women's shelter, a safe but temporary place, with strict rules and constant pressure to find a permanent solution. That's when they found the abandoned building on Roosevelt Road. Maria knew it was risky, but winter was coming, and Tommy was starting to cough a lot. They needed a place to stay without having to leave every 30 days. "Of course we will, son," she said, forcing a smile. "Mom is working hard to earn enough money. Remember the part-time job I got at the bakery?" Tommy nodded eagerly. "And you said maybe you'd get more hours next week?" "That's right." Maria didn't mention that the 12 hours a week barely covered food, and the owner hinted she might lose shifts if she couldn't work some weekends, impossible since she had no one to watch Tommy. The boy finished eating and carried his plate to the small basin they used for washing dishes. His movements were careful, precise. He knew they couldn't afford to break anything. "Mom, can I draw a little more before it gets dark?" he asked, grabbing the colored pencils Maria had found abandoned in a park. "Sure, sweetie, but don't use too much red, okay? It's the last one we have." Tommy smiled and settled near the window, where natural light still let him see the colors. Maria watched him for a moment. How did he keep that innocence, that ability to find joy in the simplest things? Sometimes she felt Tommy was stronger than she was. The afternoon silence was broken by a sound that made Maria's heart race. Men's voices outside the building. She cautiously approached the window, peeking through the makeshift curtain she had made from an old sheet. 3 men in suits stood on the sidewalk, accompanied by 2 police officers. One held papers in his hand and pointed at the building while talking on his cell phone. "Tommy," Maria said, her voice suddenly tense. "Come here, quick." The boy immediately noticed the change in his mother's tone. His large, frightened eyes locked on her face. "What is it, Mom?" Maria pulled him away from the window, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Tommy could hear it. I think they've come to get us, honey." The sound of footsteps climbing the stairs echoed through the empty building, each step heavy like a funeral bell. Tommy instinctively stepped in front of his mother, his small fists clenched, as if he could protect her from what was coming. "Don't worry, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling just a little. "We'll be okay. You said we always are." Maria hugged her son tightly, feeling tears burn her eyes as the voices grew closer and closer to their makeshift door. The knocks on the door echoed through the empty hallway like thunder, each bang reverberating off the peeling walls and making Maria's heart leap in her chest. Tommy instinctively moved closer to her, his small fingers entwining with hers with surprising strength for a 9-year-old. "Chicago Police Department! We have an eviction order for this property!" The authoritative, impersonal male voice cut through the plywood door Maria had improvised to give the small space some privacy. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find strength somewhere deep within herself, the same place she had drawn courage from so many times in recent months. "Just a minute, please," she shouted back, her voice cracking slightly. I'm coming." Her hands trembled as she quickly fixed her hair and brushed the back of her hand across her face, trying to hide any sign of tears. Tommy watched her with those big, expressive eyes, as if memorizing every detail of her face. "Mom, are you okay?" he whispered. "I am, sweetheart," she lied, forcing a shaky smile. "Remember what we always say? Sometimes things get hard, but we're strong, right?" Tommy nodded solemnly, his little shoulders straightening like a soldier preparing for battle. The door creaked open loudly, revealing 5 men in the dark hallway. 2 uniformed police officers flanked 3 men in suits on, clearly the court officer, carrying a clipboard with official documents, and 2 others Maria assumed were private security guards. The cold air from the hallway immediately swept into the small, warm space, making her shiver. "Ma'am," said the court officer, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a tired expression from having carried out thousands of similar evictions. "I'm Officer Robert Hayes. I have an eviction order issued by the Cook County Court. You have 1 hour to gather your belongings and leave the property." Maria felt her legs weaken. 1 hour. 60 minutes to dismantle the only home she and Tommy had known in the past 6 months. "Officer Hayes," she began, her voice weaker than she intended. "Please, I understand we have to leave, but could we have a little more time? Just a few days? It's the middle of winter, and I have a child." She gestured toward Tommy, who remained half hidden behind her, watching the men with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Ma'am, I understand your situation," the officer said, genuine kindness in his voice that contrasted with the cold nature of his mission. "But this is private property, and the order is clear. 1 hour is the standard time allowed by law." One of the guards, a tall, muscular man with a military haircut, stepped forward. "And if you don't cooperate voluntarily, we will be forced to use other means." The implied threat made Maria's blood run cold. She couldn't let Tommy witness anything more traumatic than what he was already experiencing. "Please," she insisted, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. "I have nowhere to go. Not today. It's well below freezing outside. And my son. Look at him. He's just a child." That's when Tommy stepped out from behind his mother. The 9-year-old boy took 3 determined steps forward, positioning himself between Maria and the 5 adult men. His back was straight, chin raised, and there was a dignity in his stance that left everyone present momentarily speechless. "Why are you taking our home?" Tommy asked, his voice clear and fearless, though Maria could see his small hands trembling slightly. Officer Hayes seemed surprised by the child's direct question. He bent down slightly, coming closer to Tommy's level. "Son, he said gently. This building belongs to someone else. You can't stay here without permission. But we're not hurting anyone, Tommy countered, his child's logic piercing in its simplicity. We just need a place to sleep, and it's really cold outside. Maria felt her heart break. Her boy, her precious child, was trying to protect her with arguments no child should ever have to make. Tommy, come here, she said softly, reaching out to him. But Tommy didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Officer Hayes. Do you have children? He asked, the question echoing down the cold hallway like a bell. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with a humanity everyone there was trying to ignore in order to do their professional duty. Maria saw one of the officers look away, and Officer Hayes swallow hard. Son, the officer finally said, yes, I do. And that's why I understand how hard this is. But there are places where you can get help. Shelters, organizations. We've already tried the shelters, Tommy interrupted, his voice gaining an intensity that made Maria realize how much he had absorbed from their late-night whispered conversations. They only let us stay for a little while, then we have to leave again. At least here, we could stay together. Maria could no longer hold back. She knelt next to Tommy and pulled him into a tight hug, her tears soaking the soft hair of the boy. Shh, sweetheart, she whispered in his ear. It's not their fault. They're just doing their job. But Tommy gently pulled away from the hug, still staring at the men with a determination that made everyone uncomfortable. If this building belongs to someone, he said, why doesn't that person live here? Why don't they want us to stay if they're not even using it? The question cut through the air like a sharp blade. A simple question, but it exposed the fundamental cruelty of the situation. A vacant building denied to people who desperately needed shelter. Tommy, please. Maria stood and placed her hands on her son's shoulders. We have to go. Let's gather our things. Officer Hayes checked his watch. Very well, ma'am. You have 53 minutes left. Maria nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She turned to the corners of the small space where they had organized their lives, beginning to fold the blankets that had served as bed, bath towels, and cover during the cold months. Tommy followed silently, helping to put the few belongings they owned into plastic grocery bags Maria had carefully saved. One change of clothes each, some cans of food they had managed to save, Tommy's precious colored pencils, 2 thin towels they had been given by a church. Don't forget my drawings, Mom, Tommy said, pointing to the sheets of paper spread near the window. Maria carefully picked up her son's artwork drawings of houses with gardens, smiling families, bright suns, and colorful rainbows. Each drawing was a window into Tommy's dreams, into a world where they had a real home. As they packed, the 5 men stayed in the hallway, watching in uncomfortable silence. Maria felt the weight of their stares, the heavy conscience of men who knew they were part of something morally questionable, though legally justified. All set, Maria said at last, carrying 2 plastic bags containing everything they owned. Tommy held a third smaller bag and his precious collection of drawings. They walked toward the door, where the men stepped aside to let them pass. In the hallway, the feeling of dislocation was almost physicalis if they were being torn from the only place they knew. Mom, Tommy whispered as they descended the creaky stairs. Where do we go now? Maria had no answer. She just squeezed Tommy's small hand a little tighter, trying to convey through touch the security she couldn't put into words. We'll figure it out, sweetheart, she replied. We always do. The building's front door opened with one final creak, and the icy Chicago wind hit them like a solid wall. The temperature was well below freezing, and Maria felt the cold cutting through her thin jacket. Tommy paused for a moment at the door, looking back at the building that had been their home. Goodbye, house, he said softly, his breath forming little clouds in the cold air. Then he squeezed Maria's hand even tighter and started walking down the cold Chicago streets. His small feet hit the frozen concrete in a determined rhythm, as if every step was a statement that they would not be defeated. Maria looked up at the gray sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear between heavy clouds promising more snow. She didn't know where they were going, or where they would sleep that night. But she knew one thing. As long as she had Tommy by her side, she would find a way to keep going. Behind them, the men watched the mother and son disappear into the city crowd, each carrying the silent weight of a decision that was technically correct, but deeply wrong. The black limousine slid silently down West Roosevelt Road, its engine nearly inaudible against the distant roar of Chicago traffic. The tinted windows reflected the glow of streetlights beginning to flicker on at dusk, while the luxury vehicle seemed completely out of place in this run-down part of the city. Richard Morrison adjusted the cuffs of his Italian shirt and glanced out the window, watching the abandoned buildings that dotted the urban landscape like broken teeth. Normally, he would never bother to oversee an eviction in persona. Lawyers and property managers handle those minor matters. But today was different. Today, he wanted to send a message. "Stop here, James," he instructed the driver, his sharp voice echoing through the quiet interior of the car. The limousine came to a smooth halt in front of the faded red brick building, its wheels whispering against the cracked asphalt. Richard took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of genuine leather that filled the car's cabin, mentally preparing himself for what he considered an unpleasant but necessary task. He had built his real estate empire on rigid principles: zero tolerance for squatters, strict enforcement of contracts, and maintaining order across all his properties. Any sign of weakness could set dangerous precedents, and Richard Morrison hadn't gotten where he was by being lenient. The limousine door clicked open softly, and Richard emerged like an imposing figure. His black cashmere overcoat cost more than most people earned in a month, and his Italian leather shoes gleamed even in the dim streetlight. At 42, he radiated a kind of power that came not just from wealth, but from decades of building an unyielding reputation in the business world. That's when he saw them. Across the street, two figures crouched beside a pile of plastic bags. A thin woman in a worn jacket held a small child close to her chest, both visibly shaking in the biting Chicago cold. Vapor hung from their breath in small clouds that quickly faded into the chilly air. Richard furrowed his brow. These had to be the squatters who were evicted today. The sight should have brought him satisfaction. Another clean property, another problem solved. Instead, an inexplicable irritation swelled in his chest. "Hey!" he shouted, striding across the street with determined long steps. "You can't stay here!" Maria Santos looked up quickly, her eyes widening as she saw the tall man approaching her. Even after 10 years, with graying hair at the temples and deeper lines around his eyes, she recognized him instantly. How could she forget that face? Those piercing blue eyes that once made her feel special, desired, loved? Her heart started racing not out of fear, but a tangled mix of hope, pain, and bitter nostalgia that hit her like a punch to the gut. "Richard?" she whispered, barely audible over the wind whistling between the buildings. Tommy, who had been quietly curled against his mother's chest, felt the sudden tension in his body. He looked up, seeing Maria's eyes fixed on the approaching man, and instinctively hid further behind her, his small fingers clutching the worn fabric of her jacket. Richard stopped abruptly a few feet away, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion. There was something familiar in the woman's voice, the shape of her face, but he couldn't place the memory. "This is my property," he said coldly, completely ignoring her use of his first name. "You were legally evicted today. You can't stay here." Maria slowly stood, her legs trembling from both the cold and the overwhelming emotion of facing the man who had been so many things in her life: lover, hope, and eventually, one of her greatest disappointments. "Richard, it's me," she said, taking a hesitant step toward him. Maria Santos. We know each other. From a long time ago." Tommy stayed close to his mother's legs, his wide eyes watching the exchange between the adults. He could feel something important was happening, something beyond just being kicked out of another place. Richard studied the woman's face more carefully, a deep wrinkle forming between his brows. There was something in the curve of her smile, the shape of her eyes, but the memory remained hazy, elusive. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally said, his voice growing even colder. "And frankly, I don't care. You need to leave immediately. This area is not for people like you." The words hit Maria like a slap. "People like you." As if she were less than human. As if her current poverty erased who she had been, what they had shared. "Richard, please," she pressed, her voice gaining desperate urgency. "Don't you really remember the summer of 2014? We were together for almost 6 months. You used to take me to that little cafe on Michigan Avenue, Bistro Laurent. You said I had the most beautiful eyes you'd ever seen. Each word felt like tearing pieces of her soul and offering them to him, raw and vulnerable. Tommy looked at her in surprise. He had never heard his mother talk about any man, any past beyond just the two of them. Richard felt a growing discomfort spread through his chest. Fragments of memories began to form in his mind: a beautiful woman, shared laughter, intimate nights. But everything seemed blurred and irrelevant compared to the present situation. Even if that were true, he said, his voice sharp like a blade, it doesn't change anything. You're trespassing on my property. I have a reputation to uphold. Please. Maria took another step toward him, her hands outstretched in plea. I'm not asking for much. Just one night. It's so cold and my son. Your son? Richard looked at the child for the first time, really focusing on him. Tommy lifted his eyes to meet the tall man's gaze. There was something about those intense blue eyes that made him feel small and exposed, but he didn't look away. Instead, he lifted his chin with the same brave dignity he'd shown the officers a few hours earlier. Hi, Tommy said simply, his voice clear despite the tremble in his body. Richard felt something strange stir in his chest, a pang of what might have been conscience if he still believed in such things. The child was clearly brave, clearly smart, and obviously suffering. But business was business. Not my problem, he said, stepping back. There are shelters, government programs. It's not my responsibility to take care of every homeless person in Chicago. I'm not every homeless person in Chicago, Maria said, her voice suddenly strong. I'm someone you knew, someone who meant something to you, even if it was a long time ago. Richard stared at her for a long moment, his blue eyes cold as ice. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with a chill that made Maria physically recoil. I don't remember you, he said deliberately, each word calculated to hurt. And even if I did, that was a decade ago. People change. Clearly, you made your choices. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind whistling between the buildings and the distant sound of traffic. Maria felt tears burn her eyes, but refused to let them fall in front of him. Tommy, sensing his mother's pain, even without fully understanding the situation, stepped out from behind her and stood at her side, his small hand finding hers. Mom, he said softly, can we go now? Richard looked at the scene, mother and son holding hands, both clearly vulnerable and cold, but maintaining a dignity he hadn't expected to find. For a moment, just a moment, something wavered in his resolve. But then he thought of his investors, his reputation, and all the dangerous precedents compassion could set. 5 minutes, he said coldly. Then I want you off my property, away from this whole block. He turned and started walking back to the limousine, his back stiff and expression unreadable. But as he neared the car, he heard Tommy's voice carried on the wind. Mom, does that man really know you? And Maria's reply, low but clear. I thought I did, sweetheart, but I guess I was wrong. Richard paused for a moment, his hand on the limousine door handle, that last sentence echoing in his mind in a way that left him inexplicably unsettled. The temperature seemed to have dropped even more in the last few minutes, and Maria could see small clouds of vapor forming with every breath Tommy took. His lips were starting to turn blue, and his little teeth were chattering uncontrollably. The sight of her son suffering from the cold cut through all her reserves and fears. Wait, she shouted, her voice echoing down the nearly deserted street. Richard, please, wait. He stopped with his hand still on the golden handle of the limousine, his shoulders visibly tense. For a moment, it seemed like he would just ignore the plea and get into the car, but something, maybe the desperate urgency in her voice, made him slowly turn around. I already said I don't have time for this, he began, but Maria interrupted him. Morrison and Associates, she said quickly, the words spilling out in a rush. New York, 2014. You had just been promoted to Vice President of Real Estate Development. I was Mr. Harrison's executive secretary. But you always stopped by my desk when you arrived in the morning. Richard frowned. A flicker of something, recognition maybe, passing through his eyes. Maria stepped closer, keeping Tommy close by her side. You used to bring me coffee. Always coffee with milk and 2 spoons of sugar, because you said you noticed that's how I liked it. And you always made that joke about how I organized my papers in perfectly aligned stacks. Lots of women work as secretaries, Richard said coldly, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. That doesn't prove anything. You had a small scar here. Maria pointed to her own forehead, just above her left eyebrow. From when you fell off your bike at 8 trying to impress the neighbor girl, Sarah Chen. You told me that story the first time we went out to dinner, at Giovanni's on 47th Street. Richard's face paled slightly. Those were details he hadn't shared with many people. Memories started to form more clearly in his mind. A dark-haired woman with a warm smile, shared laughter in small restaurants, hands entwined as they walked the streets of Manhattan. And you always touched my hair when you were nervous, Maria continued, her voice softening with the memory. Especially when we were at your apartment, that building on the Upper East Side with the view of Central Park. You said my hair smelled like spring flowers. Tommy looked between his mother and the tall man, beginning to understand there was a far more complex story there than he'd imagined. He could feel the tension in the air, thick as fog, and instinctively moved closer to Maria. Richard ran his hand through his hair, the exact nervous gesture Maria had just mentioned, and she almost smiled at the familiarity of the movement. Even if I remember some of those details, he said slowly, that was a decade ago. People move on. I tried to move on, Maria said, her voice trembling now not just from the cold but from emotion. But you didn't give me that option. What does that mean? Maria took a deep breath, knowing she was about to reveal the truth she'd guarded for 9 years. A truth that would change everything. When I found out I was pregnant, she said, and she could see Richard physically recoil at the words. You had already left New York. You'd been promoted to head the Chicago branch. I tried calling you, but your old number didn't work anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy looked between the two adults, a slow and confused understanding beginning to dawn in his young mind. I called Morrison and Associates hundreds of times, Maria continued, her words growing more urgent. They said you were in meetings, that you were traveling, that they'd get back to me. But you never called me back. Richard was staring at her now, his expression a mix of shock and what might have been panic. So I wrote letters, Maria said, pulling Tommy closer to her. Addressed to you at Morrison and Associates, Chicago. I wrote, explaining about the pregnancy, asking only that we talk. I wrote when Tommy was born, sending a photo of him with you. I wrote when he took his first steps, when he said his first word. Tears began to run freely down Maria's face now, almost freezing instantly in the intense cold. I wrote when he first asked where his father was. I wrote when we lost our apartment in New York. I wrote when I came to Chicago looking for you, hoping that maybe... Her voice completely broke, and she covered her face with her free hands. Tommy, even without fully understanding what was happening, knew his mother was hurting. He turned to the tall man who was staring at them with a stone-cold expression. Are you my dad? Tommy asked, his small voice clear and cutting through the icy air. The question hit Richard like a lightning bolt. He looked at the boy really, looked for the first time. Dark hair, yes, but there was something more. The jawline, maybe. The shape of the eyes. And there was an intensity in the child's gaze that was strangely familiar. I don't... Richard stammered, his usual confidence evaporating. I never received any letters, he finally said, his voice sounding hollow. If you had written, I would have... Would have what? Maria asked, lifting her tear-streaked face. Would have helped me? Would have taken responsibility? Or would you have given me money to fix the problem and disappeared? The implied accusation hit him like a punch. Richard looked around, suddenly aware of where they were outside, in the cold, where anyone could be watching, listening. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice regaining strength. You can't just show up after all these years with a kid and claim... Claim what? The truth? Maria interrupted. Look at him, Richard. Really look at him. Reluctantly, Richard lowered his eyes to Tommy, who was staring back with an expression far too serious for a 9-year-old. I have your eyes, Tommy said simply, as if stating a scientific fact. And Mom says I'm stubborn like you. The child's innocent statement made something stir in Richard's chest, something uncomfortable and frightening that he immediately tried to suppress. That proves nothing, he said sharply, stepping back toward the limousine. Anyone can make up a story. Anyone can train a kid to say those things. Train? Maria looked at him with a mixture of pain and outrage. You think I trained my son to lie? That I spent 9 years making up an elaborate story hoping I'd run into you on the street one day? I don't know what you did, Richard replied, his voice growing colder and more distant with each word. But I know I don't have time for made-up stories, or schemes to extort money. The accusation made Maria recoil as if slapped. Extort? She whispered. You think this is about money? It always is, Richard said with a cynicism that cut through the air like a blade. A woman shows up with a kid, claiming past connections, telling stories about unanswered letters. It's always about the money in the end. Tommy, who'd been quiet, watching the exchange between the adults, suddenly stepped forward. We don't want your money, he said, his small voice firm. We just wanted a place to sleep where it wasn't so cold. The honest simplicity of the child's statement made Richard hesitate for a moment, but then he forced himself to harden again, pushing any instinct of compassion deep down. That's not my problem, he said, turning definitely toward the limousine. There are shelters, social services. I'm not responsible for every problem in the world. He opened the car door and was about to get in when he heard Maria's voice, low but filled with wounded dignity. You're right. You're not responsible for every problem in the world, just the ones you helped create. Richard paused for a moment, hand on the open door, feeling the luxurious warmth inside the limousine contrast with the brutal cold outside. And for your information, Maria continued, I never asked for anything except for you to know that Tommy existed. I never asked for money. Never asked for support. I just wanted you to know you had a son in the world. Richard got into the limousine without looking back, pulling the door shut with more force than necessary. The sound of metal closing echoed down the street like a gunshot. Where to, Mr. Morrison? Asked James the driver. Home, Richard said coldly, leaning back into the soft leather. And turn up the music. I don't want to hear anything else. But even as the limousine pulled away quietly, with classical music filling the vehicle's interior, Richard couldn't stop hearing Tommy's voice echoing in his mind. Are you my dad? And, more disturbing still, he couldn't stop thinking about the answer he hadn't given. The low roar of the limousine's engine still echoed in the air when Tommy felt something ignite deep inside his skinny chest. He had watched his mother, the strongest woman he knew, the one who always protected him from everything, be humiliated by that man. He had seen tears stream down her face. He had felt her body tremble, not just from the cold, but from the deep pain those cruel words had caused. And something inside him, something he didn't know he had, rebelled against that injustice. Wait! Tommy shouted, his voice small but surprisingly steady, cutting through the cold night air. Richard, who had already stepped inside the limousine, stopped and turned around, irritation clear on his face. Tommy, no, Maria whispered, reaching out to pull her son back. She could see the dangerous determination in his eyes, the same stubbornness he had apparently inherited from someone. But Tommy had already stepped out from behind his mother's protection and was walking toward the tall man, his little steps small but resolute. His worn sneakers made soft, muffled sounds on the wet asphalt, and steam puffed from his mouth with every quick, nervous breath. Tommy, come back, Maria said, panic thick in her voice. She knew her son well enough to tell when he had made up his mind, and the determined look on his young face frightened her. No, Mom, Tommy said without turning, his eyes fixed on the man watching him with a mix of impatience and curiosity. He needs to know. Richard took a deep breath, the cold air stabbing his lungs like tiny knives. Look, kid, I've already told your mom. My name is Tommy Morrison Santos, the boy said, interrupting with a formality that sounded odd coming from someone so young. And you're Richard Morrison. The use of the Morrison name made Richard pull back slightly, but he kept his hard expression. That means nothing, he said. Anyone can. Tommy wasn't listening. Instead, he pulled the school backpack off his shoulder-saw faded blue bag with patches carefully sewn onto the torn fabric. His small, cold red hands struggled for a moment with the zipper, but finally managed to open it. Maria watched in growing horror as she realized what Tommy was doing. Tommy! No! She said louder now, stepping toward her son. That's private. But Tommy had already found what he was looking for. From inside the backpack, he pulled out a clear plastic folder, the kind students use to protect important documents. The folder's edges were a bit yellowed, clearly kept with care for years. "She always told me my dad was someone important," Tommy said, his little hands shaking, uncertain if from cold or nervous as he opened the folder. "She said that someday, when I was older, she'd show me who you were." Richard felt something cold spread through his stomach, something unrelated to Chicago's chill. "Tommy, please." Maria was almost pleading now, fresh tears beginning to form in her eyes. That document was sacred to Harriet, was the tangible proof that Tommy had a father, even if that father had never been there. It was something she had planned to share with her son when he was more mature, when he could understand the situation's complexities. But Tommy had made the decision on his own. From inside the plastic folder, the boy pulled out an official paper, slightly yellowed by time but still perfectly legible. The state of New York's official seal was clearly visible at the top of the document, and the printed letters had that formal, unquestionable look of government paperwork. "My mom kept this her whole life," Tommy said, looking straight into Richard's eyes. "She said it was important, that it proves who I am." Richard stared at the paper in the child's trembling hands, feeling as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Part of him wanted to step back into the limousine and leave, pretending this whole conversation never happened. But another part he tried desperately to suppress was curious, terrified, and fascinated all at once. "It says here," Tommy said, holding out the paper toward Richard with visibly shaking hands, "My mom said you're my dad. It's all written here." The child's outstretched arm held the document between them, the official paper swaying slightly in the cold breeze. Richard could partially make out the heading "Birth Certificate" in capital letters, followed by the official New York seal. "Richard, please," Maria said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "You don't have to. We don't have to do this here like this." But Tommy kept his arm extended, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "You said my mom was lying," the boy said, his voice growing stronger, surprising everyone present, including himself. "You said she was making up stories. But this isn't a made-up story. This is real." Richard stared hard at the document, feeling like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Once he took that paper, once he read what was written, there would be no going back, no pretending ignorance, no denying any responsibility. "Take it," Tommy said, his voice small but unwavering. "If you think my mom's lying, then take it and prove it." The challenge in the child's voice, a brave, desperate challenge, moved something in Richard's chest. For a moment, he saw himself in the fierce determination of that little boy, recognized the same stubbornness that had pushed him to the top of the business world. Slowly, as if in a trance, Richard reached out his hand. Maria closed her eyes, unable to watch the moment when 9 years of secrets would finally be revealed. Richard's fingers touched the paper, feeling the slightly rough texture of the official document. The paper was cold from the night air, but it seemed to burn between his fingers. Tommy let go of the document and took a step back, returning to his mother's side. He had done his part. He had shown courage when his mother needed him. Now all that was left was to wait. Richard held the birth certificate in his hands, the paper trembling, slightly not sure if it was from his own shaking hands or the wind. The printed letters blurred for a moment, as if his eyes refused to focus. He breathed deeply once, then twice. Then he lowered his eyes to read. The world around them seemed to fall completely silent. Not even the distant sound of Chicago traffic pierced the suspended moment in time, as Richard Morrison prepared to discover a truth that would change his life forever. Richard held the birth certificate in hands that trembled uncontrollably, not from the cold Chicago winter anymore, but from something much deeper and more terrifying. The official paper felt like it weighed tons between his fingers, as if carrying the weight of 9 years of missed decisions, avoided responsibilities, a life that had moved forward without him. The printed letters seemed to blur before his eyes for a moment, smeared by tension and shock. He blinked several times, forcing his vision to focus on the official document that could change everything. The header was unmistakable. State of New York, Department of Health, Original Birth Certificate. The official seals were printed with that bureaucratic precision that made any doubt about the document's authenticity impossible. His eyes quickly scanned the basic information: child's name, Thomas Richard Santos. Date of birth, the 15th of March, 2015. Place of birth, Mount Sinai Hospital, Manhattan, New York. But when his gaze fixed on the section identifying the parents, the world seemed to stop completely. Mother, Maria Elena Santos. Age, 28. Occupation, executive secretary. And then, just below, in letters that felt like they burned through his retinas, Father, Richard James Montgomery. Age, 32. Occupation, real estate executive. Richard James Montgomery. His full name, not just Richard Morrison, as he now used professionally, but Montgomery's surname he had legally changed years ago for business reasons, though very few people knew it. The last name on his ID documents in 2014, when he was working at Morrison & Associates. The child's birth date, the 15th of March, 2015, meant conception around mid-June 2014. Richard started counting mentally, his businessman's mind automatically doing the math while his heart raced wildly. June 2014. He now remembered that period with painful clarity. He had been promoted to vice president in May, was at the peak of his relationship with a beautiful dark-haired secretary who always smiled when he brought her coffee. A woman whose hair smelled like spring flowers, whose hands he held as they walked the streets of Manhattan. Maria Elena Santos. Her full name was there, officially recorded, matching perfectly what he had remembered her mentioning years ago during one of their intimate conversations. She had spoken about her Hispanic heritage, about how her father insisted on keeping the traditional name even after years in the United States. Richard flipped the document over, searching for any sign of forgery, any evidence that this could be an elaborate hoax. But the official seals were authentic, the hospital staff's signatures genuine, and the paper's texture had that specific quality of official government documents. More than that, there were details impossible to fake: the hospital registration number, the health department's internal codes, the signature of the doctor who delivered the baby, all authenticated with the bureaucratic precision Richard knew well from his business dealings. He looked again at the date. The 15th of March, 2015, 9 years ago. His mind automatically calculated where was he on that specific date. He was in Chicago, already working at the new branch of Morrison & Associates, fully focused on building his career, establishing his reputation in the new city. While he was building his real estate empire, somewhere in New York, a woman he had loved was giving birth to his son, alone. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. He lifted his eyes from the document, looking directly at Tommy, who watched him with that serious, intense expression now painfully familiar to Richard. Tommy's dark hair, which Richard had vaguely noticed before, wasn't just similar to Maria's. There was something more there, something he had refused to see. The child's jawline, the way his eyebrows furrowed when focused, even the way Tommy held his shoulders straight when challenged. Richard saw himself in a mirror from 9 years ago. He saw himself in the fierce determination Tommy approached him with, in the desperate courage he showed defending his mother, in the unyielding stubbornness he had inherited. "My God," Richard whispered, and his own voice sounded hollow and strange even to his ears. Maria and Tommy watched him silently, both seeming to hold their breath as they saw the impact of the truth registering on the man's face. Maria could see the exact moment denial gave way to recognition, when resistance turned into shocked acceptance. Richard looked back at the document, as if hoping the words would magically change. But there they were, as official and indisputable as a court judgment. Richard James Montgomery, father of Thomas Richard Santos. Thomas Richard. The child's middle name was Richard. His name. "He has my name," Richard murmured, his voice barely audible. "His middle name. It's my name." Maria nodded silently, tears streaming down her face now. "He's always had your name," she said softly. "From day one, I wanted him to carry a part of you, even if you weren't there." The enormity of the situation began to form in Richard's mind like a storm approaching. For 9 years, he had built a multi-million-dollar empire. He closed million-dollar deals, conquered Chicago, became one of the Midwest's most successful real estate developers. And during all those 9 years, his son had grown up in poverty. He had gone hungry. slept in shelters, in cars, on the street, worn donated clothes and worn-out shoes. Learned to be brave and determined not because of privilege, but because he had to survive. While Richard slept in his luxurious penthouse overlooking the lake, Tommy shivered cold in unheated apartments. While Richard dined at Chicago's finest restaurants, Tommy knew real hunger. While Richard bought suits that cost thousands, Tommy grew up wearing charity clothes. Guilt hit him like an avalanche. Not just for his absence he truly hadn't known, but for all the wealth he had amassed while his own son lived in misery. For all the lost moments, all the missed birthdays, all the times Tommy had asked about his father and Maria had to make up answers. 9 years, Richard whispered, his voice breaking completely on the second word. He looked at Tommy again, truly seeing the child for the first time. He saw the clear thinness in his small face, the pallor that spoke of malnutrition, the premature maturity in his eyes that no 9-year-old should have. He saw the worn clothes, the shoes obviously too big, the patched school backpack, and above all, he saw the fierce dignity with which Tommy endured it all. The way he protected his mother, how he stood between her and the world's cruelty, how he found courage to face an adult man and demand recognition. The final realization struck him like lightning. This brave, smart, determined boy was his son, his blood, his responsibility, his family, and he had completely failed. "My son!" Richard suddenly shouted, his voice echoing down the empty street like a wounded animal's cry. The birth certificate slipped from his trembling hands, floating for a few seconds in the cold air before landing on the damp asphalt. The weight of 9 years of guilt, shock, and accepted responsibility fell over him like a collapsing building. His knees gave out. Richard James Montgomery, one of the most powerful men in Chicago, collapsed onto the cold sidewalk like a felled tree, his head hitting the concrete with a hard final thud. "Richard!" Maria shouted, running to him. Tommy stood still for a moment, looking at the man he had just discovered was his father, lying unconscious on the sidewalk. Then, with that determination that seemed to be his trademark, he joined his mother beside the fallen man. "Are you okay, Mom?" Tommy asked, his small voice strangely calm. Maria knelt next to Richard, checking his breath, gently trying to wake him. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered, looking at the pale face of the man she once loved, the man who had given life to her most precious son. "I don't know." The world slowly came back to Richard, as if he were surfacing from deep, dark water. First came the sensations, the cold concrete against the back of his neck, the metallic taste in his mouth, the throbbing pain in his head where he had hit the ground. Then came the sounds, whispered voices full of concern above him, the distant hum of traffic, the rapid footsteps nearby. "He's waking up," he heard Maria's gentle voice, heavy with relief. Richard blinked several times, his vision gradually adjusting to the street lamp light. Above him, 2 faces looked down with genuine worry. Maria, her dark hair framing a face marked by life, but still beautiful as he remembered. And Tommy, whose dark eyes reflected a maturity unsettling for a 9-year-old. "Don't try to get up too fast," Maria said kindly, placing a soft hand on his shoulder as Richard tried to rise. "You hit your head hard." Tommy stood beside her, holding a small, half-empty plastic water bottle. His small hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the tension of the situation. "I got water from the fountain around the corner," Tommy said hesitantly, pointing to a public water fountain several yards ahead. "Mom said you might be dehydrated." The simple kindness of the child running off to get water for a man who had just been cruel to his mother hit Richard like another blow. He accepted the bottle with shaky hands, tipping some of the cold water onto his face before taking a few sips. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice hoarse and strange. When his vision finally steadied, Richard found himself looking directly at Tommy, really seeing the boy for the first time. How had he been blind? The likeness was now so obvious it almost hurt not to have noticed before. Tommy's eyes were exactly the same as the ones Richard saw in the mirror every morning, dark, nearly black, with that particular intensity that seemed to see right through people. The shape of the child's face, still rounded with youth, already showed the bone structure Richard knew intimately. Thick, expressive eyebrows, a jawline that promised to become strong and defined over time. More than that, there were little gestures Richard recognized as his own way. Tommy tilted his head slightly when thinking, how his lips pressed together when concentrating, how he kept his shoulders straight, even when clearly nervous. "My God," Richard whispered again, this time the words carrying the full weight of realization. "He really is. Your son," Maria finished softly. "He's always been your son, Richard. From day one." Richard managed to sit up on the cold ground, his back resting against the brick wall beside the building. The limousine was still parked nearby. The driver was probably watching everything through the window, but Richard no longer cared about appearances or what anyone might think. "I tried to tell you," Maria said, her voice breaking with emotion. "For months, I tried to tell you, but you had completely disappeared." She looked at Tommy, who nodded encouragingly, then continued. "When I found out I was pregnant, it had been weeks since you left New York. No one at Morrison and Associates knew where you had gone. They just said you were transferred to opportunities in other cities, but they couldn't give more details." Maria paused, taking a deep breath as if preparing to relive painful memories. "I was so scared," she went on. 28 years old, pregnant and alone. But I thought if I could find you and explain, you would." She didn't finish the sentence, but Richard understood. She had thought he would be happy, that he would want to be there, that he was the kind of man who would take responsibility and love his child. "I wrote letters," Maria said suddenly, as if remembering something important. "I found out you were working in Chicago, so I wrote dozens of letters. Addressed to you at Morrison and Associates right here." She reached into her worn purse and pulled out a plastic envelope, similar to the one Tommy had used to keep the birth certificate. Inside was a stack of letters, addresses carefully handwritten in her neat script. They had all come back, she said, spreading some of the returned letters on the ground between them. Richard could clearly see the red stamps. "Recipient not found," "insufficient address," or simply "return to sender." "I tried other ways to find you," Maria continued, "but you had changed your last name to Morrison, and I only knew your real name, Richard James Montgomery. I searched everywhere for Montgomery, but you simply didn't exist under that name." Richard swallowed hard. He now remembered his decision to change his professional surname. It had been Morrison Sr.'s suggestion. Richard Morrison sounds stronger, more trustworthy for corporate clients. It was a pure marketing move, but it had unwittingly created a barrier between him and anyone trying to contact him by his real name. "The pregnancy was very hard," Maria said softly. "I worked as a secretary at a law firm, but when they started noticing I was pregnant," she paused, and Richard saw the old pain in her eyes. "They didn't say it outright, but they began to find faults in my work, question my dedication to the company. When I was 6 months along, they fired me, said it was restructuring, but I knew the truth." Tommy, who had heard bits of this story before but never all the details, watched his mother with wide eyes. "I tried to find another job, but who hires a 6-month pregnant woman with no references? I spent all my savings just paying rent and buying food. In the end, I had to move to a much smaller, much worse apartment." Maria looked at Tommy with so much love and sadness, Richard felt his heart tighten. "When Tommy was born, I didn't have health insurance. The hospital bills were huge. I tried to negotiate payments, but they kept piling up, and with a newborn baby, I couldn't work full-time." She took a deep breath, gathering the painful memories. "I managed some part-time jobs, babysitting, cleaning houses, anything to keep Tommy with me. But the medical bills kept growing. They added interest, late fees. A $15,000 debt became 30, then 50. Richard felt every word punch him in the stomach. While all this was happening, he was building his fortune, closing million-dollar deals, living in luxury apartments. "We were evicted when Tommy was 2, Maria went on. "I couldn't pay rent after I lost my part-time job. We stayed in shelters for a few months. Then I found a tiny apartment. But it was always a struggle, always chasing, always trying just to survive the next month." Tommy moved closer to his mother, instinctively offering comfort despite being only a child. "Mom worked really hard," he said, addressing Richard with a maturity beyond his years. "Sometimes she had 3 jobs at once, but it was never enough." "I always told you about your father," Maria said, looking lovingly at Tommy. "I always said you had a father who was smart and ambitious, and one day maybe we could find him. I wanted you to know you weren't abandoned, that someone out there, if they knew about you, would love you." Maria's words were like knives in Richard's heart. She had spent 9 years protecting his image for their Sonovan when he wasn't there, even as she fought alone. "I never stopped looking," Maria said. "Every time I had some extra money, I tried hiring someone to find you." But Richard Montgomery had disappeared, and Richard Morrison was just a name in a giant company. Impossible to reach. Richard forced himself to speak, though his voice was hoarse and broken. "How much? How much do you owe now? The medical bills? All of it?" Maria hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "That doesn't matter anymore," she said. "We didn't come here for money. We came because—" She looked at Tommy. "Because he deserves to know his father, and you deserve to know you have a son." "How much?" Richard pressed, his voice urgent. "Almost $80,000, Maria finally whispered. "Between old medical debts, accumulated interest, loans I had to take just to keep a roof over our heads. $80,000. Richard spent more than that in a weekend on his yacht. It was less than he paid in taxes every quarter. To him, it was a trivial amount. To Maria and Tommy, it had been a sentence to a life of poverty. Richard began to stand slowly, his legs still shaky from the shock. Maria and Tommy rose, watching him cautiously. Once he was finally on his feet, Richard looked at his son. Hisonan saw the whole story in the boy's eyes. He saw the hunger Tommy had known, the cold he had endured, the miserable apartments where he'd grown up. He saw the dignity with which he had faced it all, the courage he had developed out of necessity. And he saw love, too. Despite everything, despite the hardships, Tommy had grown up surrounded by his mother's unconditional love. He had learned to be brave, compassionate, and determined. He had become an extraordinary boy, not because of the circumstances, but in spite of them. 9 years, Richard murmured, looking at the returned letters spread on the ground, the birth certificate that proved his paternity beyond doubt, the woman who had fought alone to raise his son. 9 years I could have been here. 9 years you didn't have to go through all this. The weight of his absence, his ignorance, and all the lost chances pressed down on him like a mountain. He was a man who had built an empire but had failed at the most basic and important responsibility in life. He had a son, and he had lost 9 years of that extraordinary boy's life. Richard stood still for a few moments, the weight of the whole truth settling over him like a storm finally hitting the ground. The returned letters scattered on the cold floor seemed to silently accuse him. Each red stamp reading, "Recipient not found," proof of how unreachable he had been when they needed him the most. Slowly, very slowly, Richard began to lower himself until he was eye level with Tommy. His knees touched the cold concrete sidewalk, his designer pants soaking up the moisture, but he barely noticed. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Montgomery knelt before someone not in submission, but in recognition of something far greater than himself. Face to face with his son, Richard could see more clearly the similarities he had missed before. Tommy's eyes weren't just the same color as his, they held the same intense, focused expression. There was a small, nearly invisible scar on the corner of the child's left forehead, and Richard automatically touched the similar scar on his own fascia mark he got at age 8 when he fell from his bike. "Tommy," Richard said, his voice so full of emotion he could barely form the words. I need you to know something very important." Tommy watched him with those serious eyes, still keeping a cautious distance, but clearly listening to every word. "I never knew you existed," Richard continued, tears starting to run down his face. "I swear to you, on everything sacred, if I had known you were here, if your mother needed me, that you both were going through all this, I would have run to New York the minute I found out." He took a deep breath, trying to steady the emotion that threatened to completely break his voice. "But that doesn't excuse me," he said. "Nothing excuses me for not being here, for not being the father you deserved, for letting your mother carry all this weight alone." Richard extended his trembling hands, not touching Tommy, but offering the gesture. "I don't expect you to forgive me. You owe me nothing. But I need you to know, I'm sorry. Sorry for every night you went hungry, for every cold you felt, for every time you wondered where your dad was." Tommy looked at Richard's extended hands, then at his face, then at his mother, who watched the scene with tears silently streaming down her cheeks. You really didn't know? Tommy asked softly but clearly. Mom said you didn't know, but sometimes I thought maybe you did and just didn't want to. No, Richard said with absolute certainty. Never, ever. If I knew, I would have moved mountains to be here. I would have left everything behind to be your dad. He paused, looking directly into Tommy's eyes. I know you don't know me. I know I'm a stranger to you, but if you give me a chance, I want to try to be the father you always deserved. Not to replace all the lost years, that's impossible. But to be here for all the years we still have ahead. Tommy was silent for a long moment, his small face showing a maturity impossible for a 9-year-old. Finally, he stepped forward, his small hands touching Richard's. I always wanted a dad, he said simply. I always wanted someone to be there to help Mom when she cried at night because the bills were too many. The words stabbed Richard's heart. The image of Maria crying alone, carrying all the responsibility while he slept in his luxury penthouse, was almost unbearable. Can I give you a hug? Richard asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Tommy nodded slowly, and Richard wrapped him in his arms for the first time. The boy was smaller than Richard expected, thinner, more fragile. He could feel Tommy's ribs through his thin jacket, could feel how small and delicate the child's shoulders were. But Tommy was strong. Richard could feel it, tooth strength born from facing hardships no child should know. The courage from protecting his mother. The determination that had led him to search for his father. Tommy hesitated for just a moment, then returned the hug, his small arms circling Richard's neck. And in that moment, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years, a deep and immediate connection with another human being. Instant and overwhelming love for this brave child who had grown up without him. I love you, Richard whispered into Tommy's ear. I know you don't know me yet, but I already love you more than I ever thought possible. Tommy squeezed the hug a little tighter, and Richard felt small, warm tears touch his neck. I love you too, Tommy murmured. I have always loved you, even without knowing you. Mom always told me you were a good man, and that one day, maybe, we would meet. Richard finally pulled away, but kept his hands on the boy's small shoulders. Then he turned to Maria, who watched the scene with a mix of joy and sadness on her face. Maria, he said, his voice full of emotion. I have no words to express how sorry I am. He stood and walked over to her. You raised the most extraordinary boy I have ever known. Alone. Without help, without support, going through hardships I can't even imagine, and you never painted me as a villain to him. You protected my image even when I didn't deserve it. Maria sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I remember who you were, she said through tears. I remember the kind, ambitious man I loved. I knew if you had known, you would have done the right thing. I could never let Tommy hate you. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Richard said, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for everything you've been through. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, a very expensive device that cost more than Maria earned in a month. His fingers trembled as he dialed a number he knew by heart. Harold, he said when the call was answered. It's me, Richard. I need you to come to my office right now, no matter what time it is. Harold Kimball had been his personal lawyer for years, a meticulous man who handled all of Richard's business legal matters. I need you to prepare urgent documents, Richard continued. I want to transfer half of all my assets, properties, and investments to 2 people, Maria Elena Santos and Thomas Richard Santos. Yes, you heard that right, half of everything. He paused, listening to Harold's concerned voice on the other end. No, I'm not being coerced. No, I'm not having a crisis. I'm doing what I should have done 9 years ago, Richard said firmly. Prepare the documents tonight. I will sign everything tomorrow morning. He paused again, then continued. And Harold, call Amanda in the properties department. I want her to prepare the house on Maple Street, that Victorian mansion we renovated last year. I want it cleaned, furnished, and the kitchen fully stocked by tomorrow afternoon. It will be the new home for the Santos family. Maria was stunned, shaking her head. Richard, no. That's not why we came here. We don't want your money. This isn't about what you want, Richard said, hanging up the phone and putting it away. It's about what you deserve. It's about what I should have been providing 9 years ago. He looked at Tommy, who was listening with wide eyes. You have a college fund waiting for you now, Richard said. You have a safe home, food on the table, new clothes. You have everything a child should have had from the moment they were born. But most of all, he continued, kneeling again to Tommy's level, you have a father who loves you and who will never let you or your mother face any hardship alone again. Tommy looked at his mother, who was openly crying now, then back at Richard. So this means we won't go hungry anymore? He asked, with the devastating honesty only a child can have. Never again, Richard promised. Never, ever again. And in that moment, on the cold sidewalk in Chicago, with returned letters scattered on the ground and a birth certificate that changed everything, Richard Montgomery finally became the man he was meant to be 9 years ago. Not just a successful businessman, but a father. And not just a father, but a dad who had found the most precious thing he never knew he had lost. 3 months had passed, like a breath of transformative wind, sweeping away the ruins of a life built solely on ambition and bringing something Richard had never imagined possible: a true family. The Victorian mansion on Maple Street had become much more than a house, it was a home. The walls, once impeccably decorated by expensive designers, now displayed drawings Tommy had taped to the refrigerator, family photos scattered throughout the rooms, and the kind of cozy mess that only a real life can create. Tommy ran through the wide hallways that Thursday afternoon, his new Riverside Academy backpack, a prestigious private school in Chicago, bouncing on his back. His new sneakers clicked against the polished hardwood floors, but it was a happy sound, full of youthful energy. "Dad, Mom, I'm home!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the house with a naturalness that still made Richard's heart tighten with emotion every time he heard it. Richard was in his new home office, much smaller than his downtown one, but infinitely more welcoming. Photos of Tommy smiling took up half the executive desk where, before, there had only been cold financial reports. He looked up from his computer. He was reviewing the latest reports from the Santos Foundation for Families, which Maria had started 6 weeks earlier. "How was school today, champ?" Richard asked, swiveling his chair to give his son his full attention. Even after 3 months, Richard still felt a pang of admiration every time he looked at Tommy. The boy had gained healthy weight. His cheeks were no longer sunken from hunger, and there was a sparkle in his eyes that spoke of security and love. But what impressed Richard most was how Tommy had kept his essence: humility, compassion for others, and the emotional maturity he had developed through years of hardship. "It was amazing," Tommy said, dropping his backpack and coming over to the desk. "Do you remember Jeremy, the boy I told you was being teased by the other kids?" Richard nodded. Tommy had told him about a classmate who was being bullied for being poorer than the other students at the elite school. "Well, today I invited him to have lunch with me, and then some other boys joined us. And you know what? He's really good at math. He helped me with a problem I couldn't solve." The simple way Tommy had handled the bullying situation, not with confrontation, but with inclusion and kindness, filled Richard with pride so deep it nearly brought him to tears. "That was very mature of you," Richard said, pulling Tommy closer. "Do you remember what we talked about using privilege for?" "That with great resources come great responsibilities," Tommy recited, quoting the words Richard had adapted from Spider-Man to teach lessons about social responsibility. "And being rich doesn't mean you're better than anyone else. It just means you have more opportunities to do good." Maria appeared at the office doorway then, still wearing her professional suit, but with a face lit up by the kind of happiness Richard hadn't seen since the early days of their relationship more than 9 years ago. She had just returned from the City Hall meeting about expanding the foundation's services. "Did I hear someone talking about doing good?" she said, kissing the top of Tommy's head and then leaning in for a warm but respectful kiss on Richard's cheek. Richard and Maria's relationship was complicated, full of history and unresolved emotions, but they had decided to focus completely on raising Tommy together before considering anything beyond a co-parenting partnership. There was still love there. Richard could feel it in her small kindnesses. In the moments, their eyes lingered a second too long, but they knew rushing could damage the stability Tommy had finally found. "How was the meeting with the mayor?" Richard asked as Tommy settled on the leather sofa near the desk, taking his books from his backpack to start homework. "Fantastic," Maria said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "They approved our proposal to expand the temporary housing program. We'll be able to serve 50 more families in the next 6 months." The Santos Foundation for Families had become Maria's passion. With the financial resources Richard provided, she had created a comprehensive program that not only offered temporary shelter but also job training, childcare, and psychological support for families in transition. It was everything she wished she had when she was struggling alone with Tommy. "And the partner corporations?" Richard asked. "Morrison and Associates will provide free legal consulting to all families we serve," Maria said. "And the Riverside Corporation donated an entire building on the south side that we can convert into permanent family units." Richard smiled. His own company had undergone dramatic changes in recent months. He had implemented a robust social program that allocated 20% of annual profits to low-income housing, education, and family support. His partners had been skeptical at first, but the results spoke for themselves. Positive publicity attracted new clients, and employees were more motivated working for a socially conscious company. "Dad," Tommy said, looking up from his math book, "can you help me with this word problem? It's about percentages." "Of course," Richard said, standing up and walking over to the sofa. "Let's see." He read the problem over Tommy's shoulder. If a family earns $30,000 a year and allocates 25% to housing, 15% to food, and 10% to transportation, how much is left for other expenses? Richard paused, remembering when math problems were just abstract numbers to him. Now he saw real families behind every statistic. "Well," he said, "let's first calculate how much they spend on housing." As they worked through the problem together, Richard noticed how methodically Tommy tackled each step, asking thoughtful questions and genuinely wanting to understand the concepts, not just get the right answer. The boy had inherited Richard's analytical intelligence, but he had also developed empathy that Richard had lost along his journey to success. "So they have $15,000 left," Tommy said after finishing all the calculations. "That seems like very little for other important things, like clothes, medicine, emergencies." "Exactly," Richard said. "And that's why your mother's foundation work is so important. A medical emergency or a broken car can completely wreck a family's budget." "Is that why you decided to give so much money?" Tommy asked. "Because you understand now how hard it is for families who don't have much?" Tommy's straightforward question hit Richard like they always did, no filters, right at the heart of the matter. "Partly," Richard admitted, "but mostly because I realize that being rich without purpose is empty. Having money only means something if you use it to make the world better for people like you and your mom." Maria, who had been listening from the kitchen while preparing dinner, appeared again at the door. "Dinner in 10 minutes, she announced. "Tommy, put away your books and go wash your hands." "I'm done with homework anyway," Tommy said, organizing his materials. "And Mom, Jeremy asked if he can come have dinner here tomorrow. His parents work late every night." "Of course," Maria said without hesitation. "I'll call his parents to confirm." As Tommy ran to the bathroom, Maria came over to Richard. "Did you see how much he cares about others?" she said softly. "Even now that he has everything he's ever wanted, he still thinks of others first." "He learned that from you," Richard said. "For 9 years, you were his only example of how to treat people with kindness and compassion. But now he has 2 examples," Maria replied, smiling. "You've transformed into a completely different person, Richard. The man I fell in love with 10 years ago was still inside you, just needed a reminder of what really matters." The dining table, an old mahogany piece that came with the house, was set for 3. Nothing fancy, simple plates, regular glasses, forks, and knives any middle-class family would use. But to Richard, it was the most luxurious table he had ever seen, because it was surrounded by the 2 people he loved most in the world. "So," Richard said, cutting into the roasted chicken Maria had prepared, "tell me more about your day, Tommy, besides what happened with Jeremy." Tommy chewed thoughtfully before answering, a habit Richard noticed the boy had when he wanted to give a complete, honest answer. "In social studies today, we learned about economic inequality," Tommy said. "The teacher talked about how some people have a lot and some have very little, and how that affects life opportunities." He paused, looking at his parents. "I raised my hand and told the class about our foundation, how we're trying to help families who went through what we did. The teacher was really interested and asked if you'd like to come speak to the class about social work." Richard swallowed hard, once again impressed by his son's maturity. Tommy had shared his personal story to educate others. turning painful experiences into teaching opportunities. "We'd love to," Maria said. "Maybe we can inspire other students to get involved in community work." "And Tommy," Richard said, "I'm proud of you for sharing our story. I know it's sometimes hard to talk about the past." Tommy shrugged with the casualness only a child can have about deep subjects. "It's not hard," he said. "Our story has a happy ending. And if telling it helps other families have happy endings too, then it's worth it." As they continued eating, Maria shared more details about the foundation's expansion plans, and Richard talked about a new partnership his company had formed with an organization that offers microloans to women entrepreneurs. "You know what?" Tommy said suddenly. "I think we're lucky." "Lucky?" Maria asked. "Why?" "Well, most families never go through bad enough things to really understand how other people suffer," Tommy explained. "We went through hard stuff, but now we can use that experience to help others. It's like our old problems became our superpower for doing good." Richard had to stop eating for a moment, overwhelmed by the wisdom of his 9-year-old son. The boy had articulated something Richard had been trying to understand for months: to turn trauma into purpose. How to use negative experiences as fuel for positive action. "You're right," Richard finally said. "Our past struggles gave us empathy and determination we wouldn't have had otherwise." After dinner, while Maria washed the dishes and Tommy watched a documentary about marine conservation in the living room, Richard went upstairs to his home office. He opened the top drawer of his desk and took out something he had carefully kept for 3 months. Tommy's birth certificate, the yellowed piece of paper that had changed everything, was now protected in a simple yet elegant frame. Richard had placed it in a place of honor on his bookshelf, among photos of Tommy and Maria, and a small drawing Tommy had made of the family. He held the frame carefully, reading once more the words he had memorized. Thomas Richard Santos, born the 12th of March, 2014. Father, Richard James Montgomery. No certificates or trophies in his collection were more valuable than this piece of paper. It represented not only proof of fatherhood, but proof that the most important things in life, love, family, purpose, couldn't be bought or earned through shrewd business deals. "Richard," Maria's soft voice called from the door. He turned, still holding the frame. "Tommy wants you to come watch the documentary with him," she said. "It's about how plastic pollution affects sea turtles." "Sure," Richard said, carefully putting the certificate back in place. "I'm coming." But before leaving the office, he paused, looking around the space that had become symbolic of his new life. There were no more photos of him shaking hands with executives or posing in front of buildings he had bought. Instead, there were pictures of his family, foundation documents, and Tommy's drawings taped to the wall. On his desk, alongside the necessary financial reports, were folders labeled Foundation Expansion Plans, and another marked Tommy's Ideas for Community Projects. His son had become an informal advisor to the family's philanthropic efforts, always offering perspectives adults missed. Richard switched off the office light and went down to the living room, where Tommy was curled up on the sofa with a blanket, completely absorbed in the documentary. Maria sat nearby, occasionally making remarks about the importance of conservation. "Dad, did you know plastic bags can be mistaken for jellyfish by turtles?" Tommy said as Richard joined them on the couch. "No, I didn't," Richard said, sitting down and instinctively wrapping an arm around Tommy. "That's terrible. Maybe we can do something about it," Tommy said thoughtfully. "Our foundation could have a beach cleanup program." "I love that idea," Maria said. "Let's research it together tomorrow," Richard promised. As they watched the documentary together, Richard allowed himself a moment of pure contentment. 3 months.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.